spring of 1834. Deep in the heart of central Virginia, a chilling discovery would forever alter our understanding of human cruelty. Beneath an otherwise ordinary farmhouse, Jar 47, children ranging in age from 6 to 16 were found chained in a cold, dark basement. These children, each bearing no resemblance to the other, spoke different languages, and when questioned, all they could whisper through their tears was one name, Mother Sullivan. The local sheriff's report, locked away in the Henrico County archives for over a century, detailed scenes so horrifying that 3 of the investigating officers resigned within a week. What makes this case even more disturbing is the horrifying realization that Constance Sullivan had been running her twisted operation for over 20 years without anyone noticing. The children called her Mother, but the truth behind that title was more sinister than anyone could have ever imagined. Before we delve deeper into the horrors of the Sullivan family and their dark secrets, I have a question for you. This channel isn't for the faint of heart, only for those brave enough to confront the darkest corners of American history. If you're still here, you're not like most people. You understand that some truths are too terrifying to ignore, no matter how unsettling they may be. So hit that subscribe button and join a community of those who dare to uncover these unspeakable stories. And tell me in the comments, what state are you tuning in from? Are you courageous enough to hear these tales from your own backyard? One of the most haunting questions that has troubled investigators and historians alike is how such an extensive operation could remain hidden for so long in a small, tight-knit rural community. The Virginia of 1834 was a land caught between the old world of plantations and the creeping changes brought by industrialization in the north. In this world, Millbrook, a small farming settlement in Henrico County with no more than 50 families, seemed typical of rural America at the time. Most residents farmed tobacco or corn traded at Henderson's General Store and gathered at the one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a community hall. On the outskirts of Millbrook stood the Sullivan property, a modest 2-story farmhouse surrounded by 200 acres of fertile land. To any passerby on the dusty road between Millbrook and Richmond, the farm appeared utterly unremarkable. The house, built in the Federal style popular in the 1810s, featured white-painted clapboard siding and a wraparound porch. A red barn stood behind the house, flanked by a chicken coop and a smokehouse, exactly what you'd expect from any rural farm. But what set the Sullivan farm apart was hidden from view. Please give me a like and subscribe so I can be motivated to create more great videos. Ezra Sullivan, who purchased the property in 1809 with money inherited from his father's tobacco fortune, had made significant efforts to expand the basement of the farmhouse. While most homes of that time had simple root cellars, Ezra's basement stretched far beyond the size of the house above it. Local craftsmen hired during the 1810s and 1820s for various excavation projects recalled working on the basement, but never seeing the entire project completed. Ezra paid generously in cash, instructing the workers to focus only on their assigned tasks without questioning the broader project. Constance Sullivan, Ezra's wife, had arrived in Millbrook in 1811 as a 22-year-old bride. Neighbors remembered her as a striking woman with dark hair and a soft voice, dressed simply but always neat. She attended Methodist church services when her health allowed and was known for her charitable works. When asked about her involvement in community causes, Constance would often mention that she and Ezra were already caring for several orphan children from her family in Pennsylvania. She explained that their care was only temporary until more permanent homes could be found for the children. This explanation satisfied the curiosity of the community about the occasional glimpses of children on the Sullivan property. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store, would sometimes see a young face peeking out from the Sullivan wagon when Constance came to town for supplies. The children never spoke, but Constance would explain that they were shy and traumatized by the loss of their parents, needing time to adjust to their new circumstances. The community, familiar with the widespread tragedies of orphaned children in that era, accepted her explanations without hesitation. Thomas Henderson, the store owner, later recalled that Constance was one of his best customers. Every 2 weeks, she would arrive with a detailed list and enough cash to purchase large quantities of basic staples flour, cornmeal, salt pork, molasses, and more. The quantities seemed odd for a childless couple, but when Thomas mentioned it, Constance would remind him of the orphaned bushwoman children. She also purchased unusually large amounts of basic medicines, explaining that children from poor backgrounds often arrived with various ailments that needed attention. The Sullivan farm operated on an unusual schedule. While most families in the area worked from dawn to dusk, the Sullivan property saw activity late into the night. Lights often flickered in the farmhouse windows at odd hours, and sounds of hammering or construction work echoed through the fields long after dark. When neighbors asked about the late-night activity, Ezra explained that he was making improvements to accommodate the growing number of children in their care. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician serving the Millbrook area, remembered several occasions when he was called to the Sullivan farm during the 1820s and early 1830s. Each time, Constance would tell him that one of the orphaned children had fallen ill and needed medical care. However, the doctor was never allowed to examine the children directly. Instead, Constance would describe the symptoms in detail and request specific medications. When Dr. Whitfield insisted on seeing the children himself, Constance would explain that the children were too frightened by strangers and too traumatized to allow anyone unfamiliar to examine them. The deception was so complete that even Reverend Samuel Matthews, the local pastor, believed in the Sullivan family's charitable efforts. During his occasional visits to the farm, Reverend Matthews praised Constance and Ezra for their Christian compassion in caring for so many unfortunate children. He offered to help find permanent homes for the orphaned children. But Constance always assured him that she was already in contact with relatives in Pennsylvania, who would take the children once arrangements were made. She explained that it would simply take patience and careful planning. What none of the community members realized was that Constance Sullivan had been perfecting her elaborate ruse for over 2 decades. The orphaned children were not transient guests waiting for loving homes. They were prisoners bought, kidnapped, or lured from their families across several states, subjected to unimaginable conditions that would break even the hardest criminals. The chain of events that would ultimately reveal the horrors hidden on the Sullivan property began with a series of unremarkable incidents in early 1834. The winter of that year had been particularly severe, with temperatures dropping well below freezing for weeks. The bitter cold would play a pivotal role in the discovery of the 47 children trapped beneath the Sullivan farmhouse. On February 23, 1834, a traveling merchant named Jacob Stern was making his way from Richmond to Charlottesville when a violent snowstorm forced him to seek shelter. The Sullivan farm, the nearest building along the road, seemed like the best option for emergency lodging. Ezra Sullivan, though visibly reluctant, couldn't turn away a stranded traveler in such perilous conditions. Stern would later recall the evening as tense and uncomfortable. Constance served a simple meal of cornbread and salt pork, but the conversation was strained, filled with awkward silences. The Sullivans exchanged nervous glances and jumped at every sound. When Stern inquired about the children he had heard lived on the farm, Constance explained that they were all asleep and should not be disturbed. She said the children had been ill with fever and needed their rest. What troubled Stern most, however, was the faint sound of muffled crying that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. The next morning, when he mentioned the noise to Ezra, the man casually dismissed it, claiming it was probably just wind whistling through the gaps in the old house's foundation, a common occurrence, especially in cold weather. Stern accepted the explanation, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered. 3 weeks later, on March 15th, the next troubling incident occurred. Mary Catherine Flynn, a young Irish immigrant traveling with her family to find work in the tobacco fields near Richmond, became separated from the group during a river crossing. Exhausted and terrified, she found her way to the Sullivan farm, where Constance offered her food and shelter for the night. Mary Catherine would never be seen alive again. Her family, after reporting her missing, described the last known location and direction she had been traveling. Despite a search party being formed, the vast wilderness of Virginia made finding a single person nearly impossible. The search was abandoned after a week, and Mary Catherine was presumed dead from exposure or killed by wild animals. The final event that would ultimately lead to the discovery took place on April 2nd, 1834. A local farmer named William Hutchinson was hunting rabbits near the edge of the Sullivan property when he heard something that stopped him dead in his tracks. From the direction of the farmhouse, he heard the unmistakable sound of children screaming horrific, desperate shrieks filled with terror. Not the usual playful cries of children. Hutchinson, heart pounding, crept closer to investigate, hiding behind a group of oak trees about 50 yards from the house. For nearly an hour he listened, his unease growing with each passing minute. The screams continued intermittently, always seeming to come from beneath the house. At one point, Hutchinson saw Ezra Sullivan emerge from a cellar door at the side of the house, looking around nervously before disappearing back underground. When Hutchinson later shared his findings with his neighbors, opinions were split. Some believed the children might be troubled, perhaps needing discipline or medical care that could be distressing. However, others began recalling odd details that they hadn't thought much of before, like the large amounts of food Constance was purchasing, the strange sounds some neighbors had heard late at night, and the fact that none of the supposed orphans had ever been seen outside the farm or at community events. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, a seasoned lawman who had served Henrico County for over 15 years, initially dismissed the concerns as nothing more than idle gossip. But when William Hutchinson insisted on filing a formal complaint, Crawford agreed to investigate. The law required him to follow up on any report of child abuse, no matter the source. On the morning of April 8th, Sheriff Crawford and his deputy Marcus Webb set out for the Sullivan farm, expecting to conduct a routine inspection that would settle the rumors once and for all. When they arrived, Constance greeted them with a calm, friendly demeanor. She invited the officers inside, offering them coffee and expressing her concern over the gossip circulating in the community. The conversation started innocently enough. Constance once again explained the situation with the orphaned Darby children, showing the officers letters she claimed to have received from her relatives in Pennsylvania, and offering to arrange for the children to meet with Sheriff Crawford once they had recovered from their recent illness. Everything seemed entirely reasonable, until Deputy Webb asked to use the privy. As Webb made his way around the side of the house, he noticed something that sent a chill through his spine. The cellar door, which he had seen Ezra use, was secured with 3 separate padlocks, heavy chains wrapped around the handles. The wood around the locks was gouged and scraped, showing signs of frantic clawing, as if someone had tried desperately to break free from the inside. When Webb returned to the house and quietly shared his discovery with Sheriff Crawford, both men understood they were no longer dealing with mere neighborhood rumors. Crawford, his suspicions now confirmed, politely requested Constance to show them the cellar. He explained that a thorough inspection would help clear up the gossip once and for all. The change in Constance Sullivan's demeanor was immediate and chilling. Her face turned ashen, her hands trembled uncontrollably, and she began stammering nervously about how the cellar was dangerous, how the children weren't allowed down there, and how there was nothing to see but old farm equipment and storage. It was then that they heard it, the unmistakable sound of children crying from somewhere beneath their feet, followed by a weak voice calling for help. The sound was muffled, but it was clear and coming directly from below the kitchen where they stood. The aftermath of that first discovery would haunt Sheriff Crawford for the rest of his life. When he and Deputy Webb finally forced open the cellar door, the stench that rose from the darkness below was overwhelming. A pungent mixture of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else, something that Crawford later described as the very scent of despair itself. The basement that Ezra Sullivan had spent over 2 decades constructing was a calculated masterpiece of cruelty. The main chamber extended far beyond the footprint of the house above, reaching deep into the earth like an underground warren designed to imprison. Stone walls meticulously mortared and designed to dampen sound created a labyrinth of interconnected rooms. The largest chamber directly beneath the kitchen housed most of the children. They were shackled to iron rings embedded in the stone walls, their ankles bound by chains long enough to allow only a small area of movement, yet no possibility of escape. The children, ranging from 6 to 16 years old, were emaciated, their clothes reduced to rags, their bodies bearing the brutal scars of prolonged neglect and abuse. Many showed signs of severe illness, fever, respiratory problems, and skin conditions, all a consequence of living in the damp, unventilated underground space. But what struck both officers the most was the silence. After the initial cries for help, the children remained completely still, saying nothing. They simply stared at the newcomers with hollow eyes, eyes that held no hope, no expectation of rescue. Deputy Webb, a father of 4, had to leave the basement twice to vomit. Sheriff Crawford, despite his years of experience, found himself frozen, unable to fully process the horrors before him. The methodical nature of the imprisonment, the evidence of careful planning. The sheer number of victims, it was beyond his comprehension. In the smaller chambers of the cellar, Crawford and Webb found further evidence of the Sullivan family's twisted system of control. One room contained stocks and restraining devices clearly designed for punishment. Another held what appeared to be a crude medical area where the children were treated not out of compassion, but merely to keep them alive and functional. A third room contained detailed records that would prove crucial in exposing the full extent of the operation. The records were horrifying. They contained names, ages, dates of arrival, and notes on each child's condition and behavior. The documents revealed that children had been arriving at the farm regularly since 1812, shortly after Constance Sullivan first came to Millbrook. The sources varied. Some were orphans purchased from overcrowded poorhouses, others were runaways lured by promises of food and shelter, and still others had been simply kidnapped from their families. Over the years, more than 90 children had passed through the Sullivan basement. The question that immediately arose, what happened to the others, was answered in the most chilling way possible. In a separate chamber accessible only through a narrow passage that required crawling, Crawford and Webb found the remains of at least 36 children. Some had died from illness or malnutrition, while others showed signs of violent death. Their bodies had been buried in shallow graves beneath the basement floor covered with lime to control the smell and decay. The investigation that followed this horrific discovery continued for months as authorities struggled to understand how such a monstrous operation could have remained hidden for over 2 decades. The answer lay in Constance Sullivan's brilliant yet horrifying understanding of deception and human psychology. She had carefully crafted a persona that allowed her to avoid suspicion in the small rural community of 1830s Virginia. The character of a charitable woman caring for orphaned children aligned perfectly with the community's Christian values, providing a ready explanation for the strange activities and the occasional glimpses of children. Her story of traumatized children who were too scared to interact with strangers offered a simple excuse for why the children were never seen in public. The claim that the children's permanent homes were being arranged with distant relatives explained why they never left the farm. Most cunningly, Constance had instilled the children with the idea that they were her family, teaching them to call her mother, which if ever overheard would appear entirely natural. When children were glimpsed by outsiders, they were carefully coached to remain silent and appear shy rather than terrified. The substantial food purchases Constance made were justified by the presence of multiple children, and the large quantities of medical supplies were explained away by the supposed poor health of orphaned youngsters. The physical setup of the operation was equally well planned. The basement construction was spread over many years, with different workers handling different aspects of the project, ensuring no one person ever saw the full layout or understood its true purpose. The soundproofing of the basement was so effective that even neighbors who were often close to the property rarely heard anything suspicious. And when they did, the noises could be easily explained away as ordinary farm activities or the sounds of children playing. Most disturbingly, however, was the psychological control that Constance exerted over her captives. The children were told that their families had abandoned them, that no one was looking for them, and that the outside world was dangerous and hostile. Those who behaved were given slightly better food and living conditions, while those who caused trouble were punished, serving as examples for the others. Over time, the majority of the children came to accept their captivity as the only life they knew. The community's reaction to the discovery was one of complete disbelief. Many residents initially refused to believe that Constance Sullivan, the quiet, charitable woman they had known for over 20 years, could be capable of such monstrous acts. Some suggested that perhaps her husband Ezra had coerced her, or that there had been some misunderstanding. However, as more evidence emerged, these denials became impossible to maintain. The records in the basement included not only detailed information about the children, but also correspondence with criminal contacts in other states. It was soon clear that Constance Sullivan had been part of a vast child trafficking network, buying and selling young victims across state lines. The Sullivan farm was just one piece of a larger, far-reaching criminal network that spanned from Pennsylvania to Georgia. As Sheriff Crawford dug deeper into the case, disturbing patterns began to emerge, revealing that the operation was far more sophisticated than initially believed. The letters found in the basement confirmed the extent of Constance Sullivan's involvement in human trafficking. Written in a simple code, these letters discussed merchandise deliveries and quality control in a way that clearly referred to the trafficking of children. One letter dated just 3 months before the discovery came from someone identified only as Morrison in Philadelphia. Morrison wrote about having 6 new items of varying ages and conditions that would be suitable for Sullivan's requirements. The letter included detailed descriptions of the children's ages, physical conditions, and most disturbingly, notes about their temperaments, which children were compliant and which might require additional training. The financial records uncovered during the investigation painted an even darker picture. Constance Sullivan had been paying between $50 and $200 per child, depending on age and condition, and receiving payments from other locations, suggesting the Sullivan farm was both a destination and a distribution point for trafficked children. Over the course of 2 decades, the total amount of money involved was staggering, over $8,000 in transactions equivalent to several $100,000 in modern currency. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician who had treated children at the Sullivan farm on multiple occasions, became a key witness. He revealed that Constance was always very specific in her requests for medications. She had detailed knowledge of treating malnutrition, respiratory infections, and other ailments common among severely neglected children. But even more chillingly, she had also requested sedatives and other drugs to control difficult prisoners. Under questioning, Dr. Whitfield came to a horrifying realization. Constance Sullivan had been systematically studying how to keep children alive under conditions of extreme deprivation. The medical supplies she purchased, the questions she asked, and even the design of the basement all seemed meticulously calculated to maximize the survival rate of her prisoners, while minimizing the resources required to maintain them. Local businessman Thomas Henderson added further pieces to the puzzle. A review of his sales records showed that Constance had been purchasing ever-increasing quantities of basic supplies over the years. What appeared to be the growing needs of a charitable household was actually evidence of an expanding criminal enterprise. Henderson also recalled several requests for unusual items, extra blankets, large quantities of children's clothing, and bulk purchases of simple medicines. The investigation also revealed Ezra Sullivan's role in the operation. While Constance appeared to be the mastermind, Ezra was responsible for the physical upkeep of the prison and the handling of the children. Several surviving victims, when they were finally able to speak, described Ezra as the enforcer who carried out punishments and maintained order. His construction work on the basement wasn't just about expansion, it was an ongoing effort to perfect a system of human captivity. The most disturbing revelation came from examining the records of children who had disappeared over the years. The ledgers showed that some children had been transferred to other locations, pointing to a larger network of buyers and sellers across multiple states. Others were marked as unsuitable or problematic, their entries corresponding with the remains found in the basement's burial chamber. The scope of the investigation expanded as authorities in other states began to look into their own unsolved disappearances. Missing children reports from Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, and South Carolina revealed striking similarities. Many of the missing children matched the profiles of those found at the Sullivan farm, poor, orphaned, or from families with little means to search for them. Federal marshals were called in to help coordinate the investigation, marking the first time a criminal case of this magnitude crossed state lines and involved federal authorities. This unprecedented move brought new challenges as the crime spanned multiple jurisdictions and different laws. As weeks passed, more survivors began to tell their stories. Their accounts were chillingly consistent: years of imprisonment, systematic abuse, and psychological manipulation. They described how new arrivals were broken in through isolation, punishment, and indoctrination until they accepted their fate. Older children were given minor privileges in exchange for helping control the younger ones. The survivors also revealed the extent of Constance's psychological manipulation. She convinced many of the children that they were worthless, that their families had sold them or abandoned them, and that they deserved the abuse. Some of the older children who had been imprisoned for years initially resisted rescue attempts because they had been conditioned to believe the outside world was far more dangerous than their captivity. The investigation also uncovered how Constance acquired her victims. She had cultivated relationships with corrupt officials at poorhouses and orphanages who provided children in exchange for payments. She also had connections with criminal elements in major cities who could identify vulnerable children, runaway street orphans, and others who wouldn't be missed immediately. Perhaps most chilling of all the records indicated that the Sullivan operation had been expanding in recent years. The number of children being held had increased, and the correspondence included plans for establishing similar facilities in other locations. The discovery at the Sullivan farm had interrupted a rapidly growing criminal enterprise that was on the verge of becoming far more widespread. The breakthrough that would expose the full scope of the Sullivan network came from an unexpected source. Among the surviving children was Rebecca, a 14-year-old girl who had endured captivity longer than any of the others. Unlike the other children who had been broken by their torment, Rebecca had maintained a spark of defiance and an extraordinary memory for details. She had been kidnapped from her family's farm in Pennsylvania in 1829 when she was just 9 years old. Rebecca remembered everything: how a woman claiming to be a distant relative had arrived at the farm and lured her away with promises of sweets and a ride to town. She remembered how she had awoken to find herself chained in the Sullivan basement. Most importantly, Rebecca recalled every conversation she had overheard between Constance Sullivan and various visitors over the years. Her testimony revealed that the Sullivan operation was merely one part of a much larger trafficking network. She remembered names, dates, and details about shipments of children being moved between different locations. Her account gave law enforcement their first comprehensive picture of the criminal enterprise. The most significant revelation came when Rebecca described a visit that had occurred just 2 weeks before the discovery. A well-dressed man had arrived at the farm in an expensive carriage accompanied by 2 other men. Rebecca, along with 3 other children, was selected to be inspected by the visitors. The man examined them carefully, checking their teeth, muscle tone, and general health, much like a buyer evaluating livestock. Ultimately, he decided not to purchase any of the children, complaining that they were too damaged for his needs. However, he left behind a letter containing detailed specifications for the types of children he wanted to acquire. The letter, found among Constance Sullivan's papers, outlined requirements for children of specific ages, physical traits, and temperaments. The language used was chillingly cold, referring to human beings as commodities. The letter was signed H. Blackwood and included a return address in Charleston, South Carolina. Upon investigation, authorities discovered that Henry Blackwood was a wealthy plantation owner who had been purchasing children for years, ostensibly as household servants. However, the investigation would soon uncover that his true intentions were even more sinister than the Sullivan operation itself. The Blackwood connection opened up an entirely new dimension to the case. It appeared that Southern plantation owners had been using the child trafficking network to acquire workers who were completely under their control. Unlike enslaved people who had some legal protections and whose disappearance might draw attention, trafficked children had no families to search for them, no legal status, and no hope of escape. Further investigation into Blackwood's operations revealed that several other prominent Southern families were involved in similar purchases. The children were used not only as laborers, but also as subjects for medical experiments, targets for violent entertainment, and for purposes so horrific that investigators found them too disturbing to document fully in their reports. As the scale of the criminal network became clear, the investigation faced increasing resistance from powerful interests. Several of the families involved in purchasing children had significant political connections and substantial resources to protect themselves. Threats against investigators, witnesses, and even the surviving children began to surface. Sheriff Crawford received anonymous letters warning him to cease the investigation. Deputy Webb was attacked by unknown assailants while walking home. Dr. Whitfield found his medical practice suddenly boycotted by prominent patients. The pressure was clearly intended to intimidate law enforcement and halt the investigation. The situation escalated further when Timothy, a boy who had been providing critical testimony, disappeared from the temporary shelter where he had been housed. A search was conducted, but Timothy was never found. The message was clear: those who cooperated with the investigation would face severe consequences. Despite the intimidation, the investigation pressed on. Federal marshals provided extra security for key witnesses, and the surviving children were moved to more secure locations. Armed guards were stationed at the Sullivan farm to protect the physical evidence. The case had become a test of whether the American legal system could function in the face of crimes involving wealthy and powerful perpetrators. The pressure reached its peak when Constance Sullivan was found dead in her jail cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but the circumstances surrounding her death were suspicious. Sullivan had been scheduled to testify about the full extent of the criminal network, including the names of her contacts and customers. Her death eliminated the investigation's most crucial witness and source of information. The mysterious death of Constance Sullivan sent shockwaves through the investigation team. If powerful interests were willing to eliminate key witnesses, no one involved in the case was safe. Just when it seemed the investigation might be derailed by intimidation and violence, an unexpected development changed everything. Samuel Pierce, a former employee of Henry Blackwood, came forward with evidence that would blow the case wide open. Pierce, who had worked as an overseer on Blackwood's plantation, had detailed knowledge of the children who had been purchased from the Sullivan network. He brought with him documents that proved the connection between the Sullivan operation and the Southern buyers. More importantly, Pierce had witnessed the fate of many of the children who had been sold to plantation owners. His testimony provided the final pieces of the puzzle, exposing the full horror of what had been happening to America's most vulnerable children. Pierce's testimony before the federal grand jury in Richmond became one of the most disturbing accounts in American legal history. Pierce, a man in his 40s, with weathered hands and haunted eyes, had worked for Blackwood for over a decade. What he had seen on the plantation and what he revealed about the fate of the Sullivan children shocked even the seasoned investigators who had thought they understood the scope of the operation. Pierce described how Blackwood's plantation operated two separate systems, one for enslaved laborers working the cotton fields, and a separate facility, the experimental quarters, where the trafficked children were kept. These children were used as subjects for medical experiments conducted by Blackwood and several associates, including 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College. The experiments aimed to study the limits of human endurance, test the effects of various drugs, and satisfy the scientific curiosity of men who viewed children as laboratory animals. Pierce's most damning testimony concerned Blackwood's detailed records of these experiments. The plantation owner had documented everything: the children's reactions to different treatments, their survival rates under various conditions, and the progression of diseases that had been deliberately introduced to observe their effects. Pierce revealed that at least 37 children from the Sullivan network had been sold to Blackwood over the years. Of these, only 4 had survived long enough to be sold to other buyers. The rest had died from the experiment's malnutrition or the brutal working conditions in the experimental quarters. Their bodies had been buried in unmarked graves in a remote section of the plantation. Pierce also provided critical information about the broader network of buyers. He had been present at meetings where Blackwood discussed purchases with other plantation owners, wealthy businessmen, and even politicians. The conversations he overheard revealed that the trafficking network extended far beyond what investigators had originally imagined. Children were being bought and sold across the country, each buyer having different requirements and purposes. The most shocking revelation came when Pierce described a gathering in the fall of 1833. Blackwood had hosted a demonstration for potential buyers from across the South. The event showcased the quality of the children available and the various uses to which they could be put. Pierce's description of the event was so disturbing that several members of the grand jury had to leave the room. The demonstration included displays of the children's ability to perform different types of work, their responses to punishment, and their suitability for various forms of exploitation. The buyers were encouraged to examine the children closely, to test their reactions, and to place orders for specific types of victims. The entire event had been conducted with the casual, business-like atmosphere of a livestock auction. Pierce's testimony also revealed the financial scale of the operation. The prices for children varied dramatically based on their age, physical condition, and intended use. Younger children, who could be more easily controlled and conditioned, commanded higher prices. The total amount of money involved in the network was estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, an astronomical sum for the time. Using Pierce's information, authorities coordinated raids on multiple locations across the South. Federal marshals, working with local law enforcement, struck at plantations, warehouses, and other facilities where trafficked children were being held. The raids were conducted in secrecy to prevent the destruction of evidence and the escape of key perpetrators. The results of the coordinated raids were staggering. Over 100 additional children were rescued from various locations, and physical evidence documenting the full extent of the trafficking network was seized, including financial records, correspondence, and detailed logs of purchases and sales. Several prominent individuals were arrested, including Henry Blackwood. 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College and a state legislator from Georgia who had been one of the network's best customers. The evidence uncovered during the raids painted a chilling picture of systematic evil that shocked the nation. The trafficking network had been operating for over 30 years, involved dozens of major buyers and sellers, and had victimized hundreds of children. The level of organization and sophistication was unprecedented for any criminal enterprise of the time. The medical experiments conducted by Blackwood and his associates were documented in horrifying detail, showing that the experimenters had deliberately infected children with diseases, tested poisons and toxins, and conducted surgical procedures without anesthesia or proper medical training. The children had been treated as disposable research subjects. Their lives were valued only for the scientific knowledge that could be extracted from their suffering. The investigation also revealed the widespread corruption that had made the network possible. Officials at orphanages, poorhouses, and local governments had been bribed to provide children or to ignore their disappearances. Judges had been paid to declare children abandoned or approve adoptions that were actually sales. Even some law enforcement officers had been involved in covering up evidence and intimidating witnesses. The legal proceedings that followed would drag on for years as prosecutors struggled to bring justice to victims of crimes that spanned multiple states and jurisdictions. The complexity of the case, combined with the wealth and political connections of many defendants, made prosecution extremely difficult. Several key defendants escaped conviction on technical grounds or through the influence of powerful allies. However, the public exposure of the trafficking network had profound effects that extended far beyond the legal proceedings. The Sullivan case became a catalyst for the first federal legislation addressing child trafficking and abuse. The case led to reforms in the oversight of orphanages and poorhouses and the establishment of new legal protections for vulnerable children. The final resolution of the Sullivan case took nearly 5 years to complete, but its immediate impact on American society was profound. The public reaction was one of horrified fascination, mixed with a determination to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. Newspapers across the country covered the story in unprecedented detail, with many dedicating entire issues to the investigation's findings. The surviving children faced a long and difficult path to recovery. Most had been held for years and had no memory of life before their captivity. The 47 children rescued from the Sullivan basement required extensive medical treatment, psychological care, and patient work to help them adjust to normal human interaction. Many never fully recovered from their ordeal, carrying physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Rebecca, the 14-year-old girl whose testimony had been crucial in exposing the broader network, became a symbol of courage as news of her bravery spread. However, the attention proved overwhelming for someone who had endured such trauma. She was eventually placed with a Quaker family in Pennsylvania, where she received the quiet, supportive environment she needed to heal. Rebecca lived to be 73 years old, marrying and raising a family of her own. However, she never spoke publicly about her experiences again after her testimony in the trial. The legal proceedings revealed the full extent of the corruption that had enabled the trafficking network. Ezra Sullivan, who had been captured during the initial raid, was convicted on multiple charges of kidnapping, imprisonment, and murder. He was executed by hanging in Richmond on November 15, 1836, before a crowd of over 3,000 people. His last words, according to witnesses, were a confession that he had followed the devil's path and a plea for forgiveness from the children he had helped to torture. Henry Blackwood's trial became a national sensation, exposing the dark underbelly of Southern plantation society. The medical records seized from his plantation provided evidence of systematic torture and murder that shocked even hardened observers. Blackwood was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death, but his execution was delayed for years by appeals and political maneuvering. He eventually died in prison in 1841, reportedly of a heart attack, though some suspected he had been poisoned by associates who feared he might reveal additional secrets. The 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College who had participated in the experiments were expelled from the medical profession and sentenced to long prison terms. Their cases led to new regulations governing medical research and the treatment of human subjects. The medical college itself faced a scandal that nearly resulted in its closure as investigators revealed that several other faculty members had known about the illegal experiments but failed to report them. The investigation's most frustrating aspect was the number of powerful individuals who escaped justice despite clear evidence of their involvement. Several wealthy plantation owners fled to Europe before they could be arrested. Others used their political connections to avoid prosecution or to receive minimal sentences that did not reflect the severity of their crimes. A state legislator from Georgia, one of the network's major customers, was censured by his legislature, but never faced criminal charges. The financial investigation revealed that the trafficking network had generated enormous profits for its organizers. Constance Sullivan, alone, had accumulated over $12,000 in profits during her 20-year operation, a sum equivalent to several $100,000 in modern currency. Much of this money was never recovered, having been invested in legitimate businesses or hidden in untraceable accounts. The Sullivan farm itself became a symbol of the horrors that had been uncovered. The property was seized by the government and eventually sold at auction. But no one was willing to live in a place associated with such evil. The house was demolished in 1845, and the basement was filled with concrete and sealed permanently. A small cemetery was established on the site to memorialize the children who had died there, though most of their names were never known. The case led to significant reforms in child welfare and protection. Virginia passed the first comprehensive child protection laws in American history, establishing government oversight of orphanages and requiring background checks for anyone seeking to adopt or care for large numbers of children. Other states quickly followed with similar legislation, creating the foundation for modern child welfare systems. The federal government also responded with new laws addressing interstate crimes and human trafficking. The Sullivan case had demonstrated the limitations of state-by-state law enforcement when dealing with crimes that spanned multiple jurisdictions. New federal statutes granted marshals expanded authority to investigate and prosecute trafficking cases, establishing precedents that would prove crucial in the later development of criminal justice systems. Perhaps most significantly, the Sullivan case changed public awareness about the vulnerability of children and the urgent need for systematic protection. The romanticized notion of a charitable individual caring for orphaned children was replaced by a more realistic understanding of the need for institutional oversight and legal safeguards. The phrase "another Sullivan case" entered common usage as a stark warning about the potential for abuse in situations involving vulnerable children. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the physician who had unknowingly enabled the Sullivan operation through his medical consultations, dedicated the remainder of his career to child welfare. He established free clinics specifically for orphaned and abandoned children, advocating for reforms in medical practice to prevent doctors from being manipulated by criminals. His later writings on medical ethics were deeply influenced by his experience with the Sullivan case. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, who had led the initial investigation, was promoted to federal marshal and spent the rest of his career pursuing similar cases. He became one of the first law enforcement officials to specialize in crimes against children, developing investigative techniques and procedures that would be used for decades to come. Crawford's detailed reports on the Sullivan case became required reading for law enforcement officers nationwide. The children's stories, which slowly emerged over the years, revealed the full scope of human resilience and the long-term effects of systematic abuse. Some, like Rebecca, were able to rebuild relatively normal lives with proper support and care, while others struggled with mental illness, addiction, and ongoing trauma from their experiences. A few never recovered, tragically dying young from complications related to their years of imprisonment and abuse. The network's correspondence, preserved as crucial evidence, provided investigators with new leads leading to additional cases years after the initial discovery. Letters found in the Sullivan basement contained references to other operations' victims and perpetrators. Some of these leads resulted in successful prosecutions, while others led to dead ends or situations where too much time had passed for evidence to be gathered. One of the most haunting revelations from the case was the realization that the Sullivan operation had been just one part of a much larger system of exploitation that had existed largely undetected for decades. The investigation revealed that similar trafficking networks had operated in other parts of the country, where children had been bought and sold like commodities throughout American history. The legal and social systems had been woefully inadequate in protecting these vulnerable individuals. The case also highlighted the role of community responsibility in preventing such atrocities. The residents of Millbrook, who had unknowingly lived next door to one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history, struggled with guilt and self-examination. How had they failed to see what was happening? What signs had they missed or ignored? Could they have prevented the suffering if they had been more vigilant or suspicious? These questions sparked broader discussions about the obligation of communities to protect their most vulnerable members. The Sullivan case became a cautionary tale, illustrating the dangers of accepting explanations without investigation, respecting privacy to the point of enabling abuse and assuming that respectable appearances guarantee moral behavior. The legacy of the Sullivan case extended far beyond the immediate legal and social reforms it sparked. The detailed documentation of the investigation, including correspondence, financial records, and testimonies, became an invaluable resource for understanding the history of crime and exploitation in America. Historians, criminologists, and social reformers studied the case for generations to understand how systematic evil could thrive in otherwise normal communities. In the end, the Sullivan family's reign of terror was ended not by sophisticated police work or advanced investigative techniques, but by the simple courage of ordinary people who refused to ignore the obvious signs of trouble. William Hutchinson's decision to report what he had heard, Sheriff Crawford's willingness to take community concerns seriously, and Rebecca's determination to testify despite her trauma, these individual acts of moral courage ultimately exposed one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in American history. The basement where 47 children had been found chained was sealed for over a century. But the echoes of their suffering continue to remind us of the importance of vigilance, courage, and compassion in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The Sullivan case stands as both a testament to human evil and a reminder of the power of individual conscience to overcome even the most entrenched systems of exploitation and abuse. If this story gave you chills, you understand why these dark chapters of American history must never be forgotten. Just when we think we've seen it all, the horrors of places like the Sullivan farm only deepen our understanding of how evil can hide behind respectable facades. If you're feeling shaken, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit the like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Together, let's uncover what other secrets lie buried in America's past. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in the Virginia hills? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkness of American history has many more secrets to reveal, and we'll be here to uncover them all. See you in the next video. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.